You're very welcome to the Institute. My name is Alex White, Director General here at the IIEA. And it's my pleasure to, as I say, welcome you, those of you who are here in person, and also those of you who are watching online. It's great to have you here to, I'm not going to quite say launch, but to introduce a draft of a forthcoming report entitled From Policy to Pasture, Bridging the Gap Between EU Climate Policy and Irish Agricultural Realities, which is the first publication from our initiative, Pathways, Ireland's Agricultural Future project. There's a lot of words in there, but anyway, you get the drift. So this initiative marks, I suppose, the Institute's return to examining agriculture and climate policy, because there was a very successful project back in 2016 called a Climate Smart Pathway for Irish Agricultural Development. And self-evidently, the global landscape has changed dramatically since 2016. But the core challenges that were identified in that report that face Irish agriculture are still there and remain very pressing. And the agriculture sector continues to be a cornerstone of Ireland's economy, serving as both a major employer and a contributor to GDP. However, we also have to acknowledge its role as a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions in our country. The agri-food sector, of course, stands as Ireland's oldest and largest indigenous exporting industry, with its expansion into new markets forming a crucial component of our economy and indeed of our foreign policy in recent decades. So there's this fundamental challenge here. How do we foster the sector? How do we foster growth in the sector whilst also honouring our international climate commitments? So this project that we brought together, it serves two essential purposes. Firstly, to provide an inclusive, neutral forum for stakeholder and public engagement on these issues, and we believe that we do that very well here at the Institute. And secondly, to deliver independent, unbiased research to inform both national and European discussion. So this is an initial paper of three. It's co-authored by Professor Alan Matthews and Dr. Matthew O'Neill, from both of whom we'll hear shortly. It sets the foundation for our future work by examining the current policy landscape and Ireland's unique position as a major agriculture producer facing these ambitious climate targets and objectives and demands that I've spoken about. I want to emphasize how much we welcome and indeed embrace and are really seeking feedback and discussion from both IIEA members and the wider stakeholder group that we have formed around this project. And we welcome, and as I say, really embrace, we'll love to have your thoughts, your comments, and so on, particularly the stakeholders, before we publish the document itself in early 2025. I emphasize that your input and the input of the stakeholders in particular is absolutely invaluable and indispensable for the shaping of this project, this publication, and indeed the other publications part of this project. So before I hand over to our distinguished chair for this afternoon, I just want to thank everyone who's been involved and continues to be involved in this project. Within the Institute here itself, my colleagues in the research and creative teams and communications and everybody involved. I thank again our engaged stakeholders. We've met in this building and they've contributed their time and continue to do so generously, their time and insight. Of course, most importantly, our distinguished co-authors, Professor Alan Matthews, who's joining us on the screen, will be shortly when I get out of your sight, and our own Dr. Matt O'Neill, who you'll hear from presently. I want to acknowledge the support, financial support of the European Climate Foundation in establishing this project also. So I hope I haven't left anybody out. Delighted to see everybody here. Interested to have the discussion, and the only other task for me to do is to hand over the chair to Dr. Karen Keaveney, who is Associate Professor of Rural Development in UCD. And thank you very much for agreeing to chair this session. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, everybody. You're very welcome to today's IIEA event, which is taking place in front of a live and, I was going to say studio audience, but online audience. As Alex said, my name is Karen Keaveney. I'm Associate Professor for Rural Development in the School of Agriculture and Food Science in University College Dublin. We're delighted today to be joined by Professor Alan Matthews, who is there on screen with us. And of course, Alan is Professor Emeritus of European Agricultural Policy at Trinity College Dublin. Thank you for joining us from Copenhagen. And also by Dr. Matthew O'Neill, who is the Climate Project Lead here at the IIEA. As Alex White noted in his opening remarks, this is the first event in a new IIEA project entitled Pathways, Ireland's Agricultural Future. So Alan and Matt have been working on the first publication in this project, which is entitled Policy to Pasture, Bridging the Gap Between Climate Targets and Irish Agricultural Realities. They are here to discuss it with you today. They want to go over their initial findings and hopefully engage in a lively discussion from our online and in-person audience, where we really do welcome questions, comments, feedback. I think key, and Alex already noted this, key really is that we have feedback, discussion. This is very much early stage and opening up the project for conversation. So before we get started, some housekeeping. Alan and Matt will present their paper for around 25 minutes, after which we'll go to discussion with you for your feedback and insights. For those of you joining on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function to ask questions, and then I will read those out. For those of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question following the presentation, raise your hand and, of course, identify yourself. A microphone will be brought to you by one of our staff here. So finally, a kind reminder that today's presentation and Q&A are both on the record, and you should feel free to join the discussion on Twitter using the handle @IIEA. So without further ado, I'd ask Alan and Matt to begin the presentation.
Excellent. Right. Next slide. You'll be hearing a lot for this. I don't have a clicker, sadly. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm really looking forward to getting your reactions to what we've been researching for the past while. I just want to give a rough talk structure. We're going to zoom in on Irish farming sector overview, then zoom out to EU climate architecture, then on to national targets, then Irish climate policies, and then a future policy outlook on what's coming down the track for us, and then we'll conclude. Next slide. Alex has already given a rough project overview, but we believe this serves as a dual purpose by providing a forum for stakeholder discussion and delivering independent research on sustainable agriculture. So that's why it's really wonderful to have such a big audience in the room. It's really important that we get your feedback, input, and ideas, because we take a holistic approach to how we understand this topic. Next slide. And then just the main focus in this paper, we tried to focus on emission trends, performance against targets, and then the different policy levers that are available to us into making decisions about how we progress forward. And then next slide. So let's get into the meat and potatoes, as they say. So the first section is understanding the challenge of climate action for the Irish cultural sector. Excellent. So the Irish agriculture sector represents a key pillar of the national economy. In 2023, the sector delivered 17.3 billion in gross added value, contributing to 6% in Ireland's modified gross national incomes. The economic impact extends through our rural regions, where 173 roughly about individuals are employed across the Irish agricultural activities from food production and then their different relative industries. Our international trade performance is particularly notable in this area, with agri-food exports reaching 18 billion in 2023, representing roughly around 9.3% in Ireland's total merchandise exports. This global reach is anchored by our dairy meat sectors, generating 6.3 billion and 3.4 billion in exports, respectively. while at the same time operating on foundation where 70% of our land is dedicated to agriculture. Ireland has established itself as a significant force for global food production. Next slide, please. As we can see here in figure 1, dairying has been an engine of growth in the Irish agricultural over the past decade. Following the relaxation and elimination of quotas from 2011, saw quotas removed in 2015, but there was a soft landing approach adopted during this. The quotas were increased from 2013 onwards, so you didn't have an abrupt change in 2015. The quotas were less binding in the year before, in 2014, and therefore you didn't have a huge shock in the system when you removed the quotas. Milk output surged by 70%. That's roughly that gap in the middle of the graph there. This far outpaced the overall agricultural output, which grew by 33% to 32% at this time. So in the next slide here, overview of the Irish farming income. We examine households in these comparisons. So if we take the national context, it employs about 4.4% of our national workforce, and it only contributes 1.8% of the national value added. Now, if we go for an income comparison, this challenge becomes clear when we look at income figures. The average farming income stands at 18,000 per unit, work unit, compared to 53,000 in the non-farm sector. The significant gap underscores the economic pressures facing those in agriculture. So if we go to categories then in this table, the farming sector shows a clear divide, full-time farmers representing a third of all farms, achieving an average income of 106,000, typically supporting 1.4 family members. However, 2/3 of farms are part-time, earning significantly less at the 11,000 mark. Now, considering the environmental aspects of all this, look at an environmental financial picture. The sector paid 59 million in environment taxes, but it received 306 million in subsidies in 2022, sorry. These figures paint a picture of a sector facing significant economic challenges marked by income disparities and a strong reliance on policy support. Understanding these baseline statistics is very much crucial as we explore potential solutions and future directions for Irish agriculture as a whole. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is a distribution of Irish farms by agriculture areas measured in hectares. The key observations to highlight is that larger farms, specifically those above 50 hectares, represent about 1/5 of total farms, approximately roughly around 25,000 farms in total. Now, these larger operations are responsible for around 3/5 of the standard output in Irish agriculture. This concentration of output also suggests that these farms likely contribute to about 3/5 of agricultural's greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So going into this table, it presents a comprehensive breakdown of Irish farming systems and their economic performance. Ruminant livestock dominates Irish farming, with 90% of farms primarily engaged in dairy, cattle and sheep farming. And then we have dairy farms, while only 12% of total farms show the highest family farm income at 49,000 on average. Cattle rearing shows concerning numbers, with just 7,000 in family farm income. Direct payments play a crucial role, with most systems receiving between 16 to 33 in total payments. In 2023 was a very poor year for farm income. The share of direct payments in the year was very high. Next slide, please. So let's break this down into 3 sectors. If we look at dairy farming first, it has maintained their position as the highest earners in Irish agriculture. However, note the significant year-to-year functions demonstrating volatility in the sector of the fluctuations. If we look at tillage, these operations typically rank second in terms of income generation, and income levels have remained relatively stable, but significantly below dairy. And then if we go to both cattle and sheep farming, consistently shows the lowest income levels. Cattle rearing, particularly suckler cow operations, show concerning income levels. Sheep farming, while slightly better than cattle rearing, still dominates consistently for low returns. Next slide, please. Next slide. Excellent. So this graph illustrates the relationship between cap direct payments and farm income across the farming systems. So only dairy farming consistently shows strong market returns independent of the actual cap itself, in relating back to the previous slide. Cattle and sheep farms, direct payments have always been more than 100% of income from farming, and this suggests that these farms are effectively subsidising their own operations with CAP payments. What these tables bring together is they paint a picture of an agricultural sector with significant income disparities and heavy reliance on support payments and sustainability. So slide 13. Sorry, next slide. I thought I'd break it up into key themes for you at this point. So only dairy farming shows consistent positive market returns. Average farm income equals CAP direct payments received. Most dry stock enterprises have income below CAP payments and significant income disparities between full and part-time farms. And 90% of Irish farms are dominated by ruminant livestock enterprise. Next slide, please. So what I want to point out here is in this slide is agricultural emissions made up 37.8% of total territorial emissions in Ireland in 2023. This represents a slight increase from the 1990 levels, as you can see to my left here. So what's the economic context in this? 39% of total emissions came from agriculture, yet the sector contributed just 1% of gross added value at this time, while employing 4% of the workforce. The distinctive profile reflects Ireland's agricultural specialisation and relatively limited heavy industry. So next slide, please. Now breaking this into a global context, there's a clear hierarchy here in emissions intensity. And breaking that down, the highest would be the ruminant-based foods, beef and dairy, followed by medium, other animal products, pork and poultry, and then the lowest would be plant-based protein sources. So the broader implications here that we're trying to draw out, while these emissions comparisons are crucial, we must also consider the nutritional quality of differences, the biodiversity impacts, food versus food competition, and animal welfare considerations. The data clearly shows that addressing Ireland's agricultural emissions means focusing on ruminant livestock. However, solutions must be balanced with environmental goals and, of course, the economic realities. Next slide, please. So if we look into historical trends here, the national greenhouse gas emissions followed distinct phases. So in the 1990s, we had a rising trend. In the 2000s, a declining trend. In the 10s, we went relatively flat. And from 2021 to 2023, we went for a notable decline. A special note on 2020 shows a unique dip due to COVID-19 lockdowns. So would agricultural emissions mirror this pattern with specific characteristics? In the early years, we had initial increase. In the mid-period, we had a gentle decline in 2011. Post-2011 was a rise in emissions due to EU milk quota regime changes, as mentioned before. And now in recent years, we're starting to see that actual downward trend, so it's not all negative in that sense. So next slide, please. So unlike most EU member states, Ireland's LULUCF sector, land use change and forestry, is a net emissions source. So in essence, the main contributions to emissions is we're talking about peatlands, wetlands as a significant source. Agricultural land is a net source, primarily because of organic soils and grasslands, showing declining emissions trends over time. Again, positive. Forestry developments historically functioned as a net carbon sink. 2023 marked a critical shift in this, becoming a net source with 1 million tonnes of CO2, causing a shift increase of harvest levels and reduced aerosolization rates. What these trends highlight is the complex interplay between agricultural practices, land management, and then the trend of emissions in Ireland in itself. Next slide, please. So this graph demonstrates a significant improvement in Ireland's Irish agricultural emissions efficiency over time. Since 2013, we've nearly seen the emissions intensity of agricultural output decrease by 45%. That's nearly half. So while there have been some fluctuations due to volatility, agricultural output, the downward trend is clear and consistent. The improvement can be attributed to two main factors: enhanced technical efficiency within farming and increased provenance of dairy farming in the sector. Next slide, please. So we've got two tables here. I'll start with table 3, looking at emissions intensity. By farming systems over recent years, we observe improvements across all enterprises when comparing it to the periods of 2016 to 2018 and to 2021 to 2023. There's been a 36% improvement in emissions intensity It's important to note that these figures use current prices, and agricultural output prices increased by over 43% between 2016 and 2023, which influences the ratio of emissions per euro output. Now, there's a different story being told in Table 4. This data tells when we look at the emissions per hectare, the overall farm average has remained stable at about 5.2 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. Dairy farming stands out significantly with emissions levels of 2 to 4 times higher than any other farming systems due to more intense production methods. We observed a slight increase in dairy emissions per hectare, while other farming systems have shown their stability of slight reductions in their emissions intensity per hectare, referring back to the emissions per euro of output in Table 3. So that's a very interesting development we found in the data. Next slide, please. So these graphs reveal an interesting paradox in farm performance. When we look at both dairy and cattle farms, the top economic performers show higher emissions per hectare, but lower emissions per unit of output. This creates a tension in climate action planning. While these farms are more efficient in terms of output, they have a higher environmental impact per land area. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean? What are the issues that we need to address? So let's start with the fundamental challenge. Agricultural emissions are inherently complex, as we can see from the data presented. Unlike fossil fuel emissions, these are primarily non-CO2 gases and produced through microbial activity. While we can't eliminate them entirely, as they are of food production, we must find ways to reduce them. The second major challenge is balancing economic interests with environmental necessities. Our livestock sector is a cornerstone of Ireland's agricultural economy, but it's also the primary source of our emissions. And then finally, we need to address our policy frameworks, particularly regarding cap payments. These subsidies are crucial for farm financial stability, but they need to be redesigned to incentivize emissions reductions. Next slide, please. So we're going to zoom out into the EU climate policy. The regulatory framework for emissions reduction operates within the complex multi-government structure. And the European Union has developed a comprehensive climate regime that works in tandem with national policies to address these agricultural emission sustainability. So, the 4 key pillars. The EU's climate policy architecture rests on these. So the first one is we have the emission trading system, or ETS, which covers about 40% of EU emissions. The second pillar is the effort sharing regulation, which complements the ETS by addressing sectors not covered in the traditional trading system. The ERS aims for a collective 40% reduction by 2030, with Ireland specifically tasked with a 42% reduction target. So the third is the new ETS2, set to launch in 2027. And then finally is the LULUCF regulation, which focuses on land use, forestry, targeting the carbon removals of about 310 million tonnes of CO2 across the EU by 2030. This is particularly significant for Ireland, which must reduce its net LULUCF emissions by 0.26 million tonnes. Together, these 4 pillars form a comprehensive framework driving the EU towards an overarching climate neutrality of 2050, which is a very big task and asked. So, next slide, please. Sorry. So, in February 2024, the European Commission proposed a target of 90% net greenhouse for GHS emissions reduction by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. This will also require a new target under each of the 4 pillars of the EU's climate regime that I've just talked about. The Commission examined 4 main scenarios, which we'll touch on now, each with a different implication for the emissions reduction and agricultural impact. The basic scenario 1 aims for an 80% reduction, maintaining current policies. Scenario 2 pushes us further to 85 to 90% reduction by incorporating corporate carbon capture technology and significant land sector reductions. The ambitious scenario 3, which is the Commission's preferred choice pathway, is a target of 90 to 95% reduction through comprehensive carbon management and agricultural innovations. What's really interesting here is if we look at the life scenario, which demonstrates how behavioural changes and sustainable practices could achieve similar reductions while focusing on dietary shifts and waste reduction. This scenario projects the most substantial decrease in agricultural emissions, reaching at 46% reduction compared to 2015 levels. Next slide, please. So we take a moment here to see in scenario 1, A huge cornerstone would be looking at the energy industry, which starts roughly at 106 euros per tonne of CO2. Notably that other sectors have zero carbon values and represents a minimum intervention approach. But if we take a moment and understand scenario two, agriculture enters at a lower rate at 55 euros per tonne of CO2, with LULUCF being introduced at 50 euros per tonne of CO2. Now, scenario three, which has high ambition and is the EU's preferred mechanism of measure, and we'll focus on that going forward. The first time agriculture faces the same carbon value as other sectors. That's a really big mind shift to think about and how we're looking at the future frameworks later in this presentation. LULUCF remains at the 50 euro mark in terms of tons of CO2 at that point. Then we have the life scenario adaptation, which demonstrates how behavioral change can reduce needed carbon values and maintain consistent LULUCF approach. And then 2050 perspective is dramatic increase when it comes to around 470 euros per tonne for CO2 for most sectors. These values demonstrate what would take to achieve a 90% reduction in emissions. A target they've shown is feasible. Think of it as a measuring stick to strengthen the action needed, rather than a specific sort of policy recommendation directly. So when you see these numbers in the modelling, they're showing us how strong our overall package of measures needs to be, not prescribing exactly how we get there. That's just a very important note when we're taking in these figures. And I'm looking over at Karen, and I will be swiftly finishing, don't you worry. Moving on to the next slide, please. So in this one, we're having the historical context of the 2015 baseline. Agricultural emissions in terms of scenario 3 for the 92% reduction reaches a 271 metric ton of CO2, and LULUCF stabilizes at 317 metric tons of CO2. Next slide, please. If we go to agricultural emissions scenario for 2040 with the baseline trajectories, and we look at scenario 3 again, this slide sort of presents that landscape. With scenario 3 hitting at 90 to 95 reduction pathway, it reaches 271 metric tons of CO2 with a 30% reduction from 2015 and assumes full technology deployment. Interestingly, if you look at the life scenario, the most ambitious at 209 megatons of CO2 and 46% reduction from 2015, incorporating behavioral changes from the farm to fork strategy. Now, next slide, please. Different supporting EU legislation for frameworks. So first, we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. This is a game changer for large food companies as it mandates comprehensive environmental reporting. Then we have the Carbon Removals and Carbon Farming Regulation. This creates a standardized framework for certifying carbon removal activities. Think of it as an equality assurance system for carbon credits. Then we have the Green Claims Directive, which is still the legislative process and is designed to combat greenwashing that we here talked about. And then finally, there's a carbon border adjustment mechanism. While it currently doesn't directly affect agriculture, it shows the EU's willingness for a broader measure to level the playing field on climate action. Next slide, please. So key takeaways from this part of the presentation is comprehensive legislative framework supporting emissions reduction, increased pressure on food companies to monitor and reduce emissions, growing opportunities for carbon farming, evolution towards more integrated climate action across sectors, and 2040 target will imply significant ramping up of ambition for agricultural emissions. Next slide, please. So we're going to delve now into the national targets and national frameworks for Ireland in these policy levers. So key elements to take away in the Irish climate policy framework. Our strategy rests on three main pillars. A 51% reduction in emissions by 2030 compared to 2018, 5-year carbon budgets that set emission limits, sector-specific emissions ceilings for different parts of our economy. The plan balances environmental goals with practical considerations, such as economic and how we can protect jobs, social ensuring a just transition for all, agricultural recognising farmers' unique role in our economy, and then scientific following the latest evidence. Next slide, please. So this translates into, if we specifically look at agriculture here, differentiated reduction targets across key sectors of our economy. Agriculture is at 25%. The lower target for agriculture in particular acknowledges both the technical limitations for emissions reduction and its crucial role in Ireland's rural economy. Interestingly, regarding land use and forestry, the LULUCF sector, we initially proceed without specific targets due to infantry uncertainty. However, the 2024 Climate Action Plan has now aligned the sector of EU regulations requiring a reduction of net emissions by 2030, measured against the 2016-2018 levels. Next slide, please. So Ireland's sectoral emission performance and targets between 2018 and 2023, which reveals both progress and significant challenges ahead. As established, agriculture, our biggest contributor, at 21 megatons of CO2 in 2018, having only achieved 2.9% reduction over 5 years. Agriculture is significantly behind its targets, and while requiring substantial acceleration, reach for their targets in 2030 goals of 25% and then a further reduction of 50% respectively. Overall, Ireland's national emissions have decreased by roughly around 7.8%. Next slide, please. So beyond the 2030 target, we also have the legal commitment to achieve climate neutrality by neutral economy by 2050, which illustrates Ireland. This graph here illustrates Ireland's indicative greenhouse gases reduction pathway. This diagram represents a pivotal element of Ireland's climate strategy. Submitted to the EU in June 2024, the pathway shown here outlines our nation's approach to achieving climate neutrality. What's particularly noteworthy about this pathway is that it includes sector-specific trajectories, with special attention given to agriculture and LULUCF. However, it's important to note and understand that these pathways are indicative only, that don't lock us down into specific sectoral emission ceilings for future carbon budgets. Next slide, please. So, first strategy proposes an ambitious but feasible pathway requiring approximately 50% reduction in agricultural emissions, broken down into a 30% points through technical measures and then 20 percentage points through diversification into forestry, tillage and organic farming. However, if we look here, the EPA projections tell a very different story. Under existing measures, agricultural emissions might actually increase by 2050 compared to the 2018 statistics. Even with additional measures, the WAM, we're looking at only an 18% reduction of 2030, falling short of our 25% target I've just outlined. These disparities between our strategic goals and our projected outcomes highlight the substantial implication challenges we face in transitioning our agricultural and land use sector towards climate neutrality. So, next slide. Consequences of missing our climate targets. At the national level, there's a robust accountability mechanism where ministers must appear before the Oireachtas committees to explain any underperformance and present corrective measures within these 3 months. The implications extend beyond reporting requirements, and any excess measures don't simply disappear. They're carried forward effectively, reducing our carbon budget period. These create a compounding challenge for future compliances. Perhaps most alarming is the financial exposure. Recent government estimates suggest that non-compliance could cost Ireland between 3.5 and 8 billion through to 2030. It should be noted that this figure is based on estimated prices allowances in the ETS pricing, as well as EPA projections for the expected gaps. However, both of these variabilities are highly uncertain, which means we need to be cautious about these long-term cost estimations and considering the multiple scenarios in our actual planning. Next slide. You'll be glad to know we're turned to the end here. So mitigation measures and policies in the agricultural sector. So our understanding of mitigation potential of technical measures in agricultural and land use sectors depends heavily on the work done by TASIC in deployment of the marginal ambient cost curves. So table 10 here, which shows us the consolidated impact of adopting mitigation measures under 2 different pathways. So we've got pathway 1, which represents a high adoption rate, and we have pathway 2, which represents a very high adoption rate. Looking at the agricultural sector first, our 2018 baseline shows emissions at 23 MT of CO2. Under business as usual conditions, we'd see a slight decrease at 21.9 MT of CO2 by 2030. With pathway 1, the high adoption rate, we could reduce this by 19.1 MT of CO2. but most importantly, pathway 2, very high adoption, who could bring us down to 17.1 megatons of CO2, beating our sectoral targets. What's particularly interesting about these findings is the cost implications. For agricultural, both pathways actually show negative costs, meaning farmers could save money while reducing emissions. Now, let's be clear, some of these measures do cost farmers more, whether that's new equipment or ongoing costs, but these costs are balanced out by savings farmers can get from other measures. Next slide, please. So very quickly, what we can demonstrate here in A is the starting agricultural efficiency measures. These are constantly cost negative. Major impacts come from improvements in animal health and dairy economic breeding index. However, we need to be mindful of potential rebound effects where improved profitability might lead to increased animal numbers. If we look at B, in this section, looking at absolute mitigation measures, about 60% of cumulative ambient abatement cost is negative. And then if we look at C for LULUCF, unlike agriculture, most technical mitigation options here are costly. Afforestation, while key to meeting targets, come with a huge price tag. Estimated costs reaching around 200 per tonne of CO2 by 2023 under pathway 2. So the data presents both opportunities and challenges. Agricultural measures often shows positive economic returns. LULUCF measures, while necessary, require significant investments. Meeting our 2030 targets is feasible, but requires exceptional adoption rates, and additional incentives may be needed to achieve these ambitious goals. Next slide, please. So here I just want to highlight some of the key mitigation measures. We have agricultural emissions reduction measures. The plan calls for a gradual reduction in national bovine numbers, with particular focus on suckler herds. Moving to carbon sequestration, these include increasing afforestation rates to meet national targets, adopting agroforest systems, and establishing small-scale native woodland plantations. And then to support these changes, several enabling measures have been identified, such as developing a national land use strategy. Next slide, please. Now, the core measures are well known. The abatement techniques expected to deliver between 3 to 4 million tonnes cumulatively reduced over the decade of time when we examine these specific targets of agricultural mitigation measures. The further measures are more speculative, including the rollout of slow-release pasture-based feed, additive to reduce methane emissions that is yet to be operationalised, and some unspecific diversification measures, and very significant increase in organic farming. Together, they expect to deliver a further 2.5 million tonnes of abatement. In total, in these measures on the screen here, become fully operational, they're estimated to deliver a cumulative reduction of 5.5 to 6 million tonnes in emissions over the 2 carbon budget periods. As this is close to the reduction required under the sectoral emission ceilings in the years 2030 relative to 2018, the magnitude of the implementation challenge can be seen here. Next slide, please. And I just want to give a quick word on CAP. With the new delivery model, the EU has allowed 9.9 billion to Ireland over this 5-year period. What is particularly significant is the shift from compliance-based to performance-based approaches, giving Ireland more flexibility in how it's allowing these resources. The plan centres around specific climate action objectives, particularly SO4, which focuses on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. Now, very briefly, complementary public policies that we need to think about around this when we're having about these mitigation measures. This very much integrated is infrastructure, climate and the Nature Fund, EU Nature Restoration Law, the Water Framework and Nitrates Directive, and the Just Transition Framework. Next slide, please. The other part of our thinking that we've started to incorporate in the report we've been writing is harnessing the supply chain initiatives in Irish agriculture. We've broken it down in different sections and thinking about market evolution, the competitive landscape, the regulatory framework, science-based targets, origin green success, and then understanding what role the private sector has and the potential it has to engage in this debate and offer support. Next slide, please. So just a note on side measures. So if we recall the 2040 life scenario in the Commission's 2040 target impact assessment, it suggests significant potential for additional emissions mitigation through demand side changes. However, the Climate Action Plan makes no explicit reference to such decide-man measures. This omission is somewhat understandable given our export-oriented economy, but it will still be important to encourage and facilitate this shift of preferences among Irish consumers. The plan does address also targets as a reduction, in which we can also contribute to be a reduction in national emissions. So we're in the final section. Next slide, please. Future climate policy. Next slide. You'll be glad to know this is just one slide. 2025 is a very significant year for the agri-food sector. First, we'll see the European Commission's proposal of 2040 emissions reduction targets of 90% compared to 1990 levels. This is expected in Q2. A crucial element of this will be the agricultural emissions. For the first time, we may see an EU-wide regulations for agricultural sector known as IIEA. The European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change will release a report on reducing agricultural emissions in the first quarter of 2024. And there's a strong indication that this may include recommendations for carbon pricing in agriculture. DG Klima is currently investigating the design of a potential agricultural emissions trading system, with results expected in Q3 of 2024. And then for Ireland, the timing is particularly significant. We'll be updating our carbon budgets with the Climate Change Advisory Council publishing its proposals for the carbon budget for 2026 to 2024 last week, actually. And additionally, Ireland will take over the EU's Council presidency in 2026, putting us in a key position of influences for a lot of these developments. All of this is happening against the backdrop of the EU's next financial programme cycle and updating the Common Agricultural Policy. So next slide. Conclusion. So this working paper examines Ireland's unique challenges in reconciling its position as a major agricultural producer with increasing ambitious climate targets. First, we must acknowledge agriculture's central role in Ireland's economy. We also must acknowledge the sector faces ambitious targets. While recent data shows some progress with a 4.6% reduction in 2023, we're still not on track to meet our goals yet for 2030. The challenge is particularly acute as Ireland's land use sector remains a net emitter, and unlike most EU countries. And the policy landscape is complex, as we can see from the role of measures and pathways and policy levers I've laid out there, combining the EU and national frameworks, with the EU moving towards a 90% reduction target in 2024. Technical solutions exist, and achieving targets is possible. However, success requires unprecedented adoption rates of mitigations measures. This must be balanced against economic viability, particularly for dry stock farmers who have heavily dependence on cap payments. The pathway forward requires careful balancing between environmental imperatives and economic sustainability. Success will depend on coordinated action across policy, industry and farm levels, and supported by approaching funding and implementation mechanisms. So next, and there we go, we're done. I had a next step slide, but it went. Excellent. Thank you very much.